Thank you, Kat, for taking the time to talk with me about your perspectives on and predictions about teacher education. You've made significant contributions to the field, particularly in regard to teacher education, special education, and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. So to start, what changes stand out to you since you began in teacher education?
Oh my. I would say one of the really important shifts has been from kind of a very program-centric view of the work, where each program kind of existed as, pretty much in a policy isolation, I'd say, and then in the 80s and particularly in the 90s, the a whole wave of federal accountability policies, state accountability policies, began bringing the field together in some ways, not entirely good ways, I think, but the degree to which programs came under scrutiny and became the focus of policymakers really changed quite dramatically in the 90s and in the early 2000s. So that certainly is one of the big changes.
And you mentioned that you thought maybe brought them together in not necessarily positive ways. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, like most policies, I would say the accountability policies in teacher education represent both risk and opportunity. The risks are that we're not as good at measuring the work as we are at doing it. And so when there's a tremendous powerful accountability pressure, particularly from the outside, it can sometimes drive the work in ways that maybe even policymakers don't think are particularly good because of the problems we have with measurement. So it's hard to measure things that are subtle, deeply contextual, deeply interactional, and that's what the work of teacher ed is really about. So now those are the risks. The opportunities, I would say, have to do with I would say that teacher education has had a terrible time over many years of learning from its own experiences. We're not good at tracking the effects of changes in policy or changes in practice. And so I'm sad to say that I think the field spends a lot of time chasing its tail and moving from one big idea to another without really being well equipped to evaluate the effects of particular kinds of innovations or changes. So the opportunity around the accountability processes is to get smarter about measuring the program outcomes and beginning to make evidence-based decisions about policy and practice in the field. And I think that's really important for our field, because if you study the history of teacher education, and I hope you are, you'll know that the field has been under pretty continual criticism from way back in the 50s. And the criticisms have been pretty consistent over all those times. One of them is that it has to do with the very weak connections in most programs, not every program, in most programs between coursework and fieldwork, or even between courses. I think there was an amazing study that John Goodlad and his colleagues did in the late 80s. I don't know if you know it, and if you don't, I hope you will, because it's a remarkable portrait of, they studied 29 programs all over the country, different kinds of programs, from big, research intensive university programs to large regional teaching institutions and small private colleges. And they collected like 1,800 hours of observation and interview data. So this is the most comprehensive study, in my view, that has ever been done in the field. And what they found was both disturbing and not surprising, because what they found, with a lot of depth, was the same kind of things that have been showing up in all of the prior critiques of the field, and all of them since, for that matter. But they found, again, disconnection between coursework, where faculty very often wouldn't know what one another were teaching beyond the title of the course. much less would they know what it was going on in the field, where they had few, if any, connections with the cooperating teachers and that were working with student teachers. And the folks that are doing supervision in the field, who really knew much more about what candidates were actually able to put into practice from their coursework, typically, as Goodlad and his colleagues found, and others have found as well, the people that are closest to the work, the field supervisors and the mentor teachers, have the weakest voice when it comes to making decisions about the program. What's going on in the field is, very difficult to communicate to faculty, and faculty have and spend way too little time paying attention to what is going on in the field. So there's this disconnection. And consequently, the effectiveness of programs, I think, is weakened by those arrangements. So the accountability pressures on teacher education really created a set of conditions that pushed programs pretty hard to start looking at their effectiveness and starting to ask questions about how can we get better at the work we're doing. So, and it's not just the accountability pressures. As you are well aware, huge issues and concerns around equity or have arisen within the field, not just in the last few years where they've gotten so much more front and center, but for the last 20 years, certainly, and even before John Goodlad's work. But those issues really mean teacher ed has to change. Teacher ed has to get much smarter and more effective at paying attention to what's going on in the communities that they're serving and in the lives of the kids that they're trying to prepare teachers to serve. And so the disconnect between courses and field work has huge implications for our capacity to get better at understanding what's going on in schools, what's going on in kids' lives, what's going on in communities in ways that have tremendous implications for how we prepare people to work in those settings. So we've got to get better. And the press for improved accountability has pushed us in some useful directions as well. So.
Well, it's very interesting, I think, and based on the work that I've done, I do agree. I'm focused in special education and did more reading on the history of special education teacher preparation, which has all of those things and more, I would say. So it's very interesting to hear your perspective. I guess
one thing one comment I would just make is that I started out as a special educator. That was my early work, and I loved it. But I came to the conclusion, because at the time we were doing a lot of research around inclusive education, I came to the conclusion that we had to get better at general ed if we were going to have any hope of creating classroom environments where kids with diverse developmental characteristics, if you could say, were going to be welcome and well served. Now that logic, I think, applies in other areas as well. But I moved out of special ed into general ed and general ed teacher ed in particular, because I came to the conclusion that nothing we were going to do in special ed was going to really change kids' lives until we created classrooms and schools and prepared teachers to understand those kids and be able and willing to engage them more effectively and more equitably than we'd achieved historically. So I'm not much in special ed anymore because my life has been consumed by teacher ed issues and research in teacher ed.
I definitely relate to that. The work that I'm doing for my dissertation is actually about collaboration between special educators and general educators, and trying to work on that piece of it. And born from my experiences in the field as a special ed teacher, needing to be collaborative with people who had very little expertise in anything about what I was doing.
That's right, and it's not their fault.
No.
Because we've separated those worlds, and you can look beyond teacher ed, of course, to look at the broader education system and the culture that we operate in, and see how many ways in which we marginalize people with disabilities, and thereby hurting all the kids. Every time we, all the energy we put into making segregated special ed better is kind of a subtraction of time, energy, and resources from the general ed classroom. And it also creates a place where we send kids that every other kid in the classroom is watching what happens with the vulnerable child in that classroom. And so when you get disappeared, when you can't keep up, that tells kids that school is a dangerous place.
Where do you think teacher education is going? Where is it headed?
I'm worried about it, actually. I think there's some really exciting things and important things going on in the field, particularly around its recommitment, its re-energization, and kind of doubling down on equity issues. So I think we're finally talking in a more real way around the ways in which school plays a big part in creating racial injustice in our culture. That's really good. That's really healthy. The future that I can't see very far ahead, though, just to be clear about it, bodes well in terms of the intensification of our commitments to equity. But I'm worried that those commitments are not paired with commitments to measurement and evaluation that allow us to move forward and not get lost in the forest, and I think the field historically can be characterized pretty accurately as being kind of wandering around in the forest from one thing to another without really having a sense of where it's going and how to get there. Now, again, there are exceptions to that, and there are important policy movements within the field that have helped the field gain some ground in some valuable ways. But right now, I think we're at risk of losing some ground. And a particular example of that is what's going on in the state of California and elsewhere all over the country around EdTPA. So EdTPA, in my view, is a flawed example of a really good idea, because EdTPA represents an attempt to collect data on what's actually going on in classrooms and to make those data accessible and useful and usable by teacher educators so that they can understand more about what's happening to their candidates when they're going out and trying to do the stuff that they've been taught in their courses. Together, you mentioned collaboration a little bit ago, and so we use those data as a context for thinking together about program outcomes and making decisions collaboratively about how to improve the practices that in ways that the data made it very clear needed to be improved. So that's the hopeful part, but also the existence of new measures that are classroom based. The worrisome thing is that there's now a movement in California to back away from EdTPA and to make it optional. The same thing is going on in the state of Washington, where I live. So a strong statewide commitment to having a common measure that allows programs to learn over time by comparing outcomes, from one cohort or one, in based on one kind of policy or practice compared to another, that allows programs to compare outcomes across programs. So to find out who's really doing well in preparing candidates to understand and respond to the needs of English learners, for example. Our capacity to do that kind of comparison and to learn from the comparison we lose that when we lose a common measure. And so that's one of the things I'm worried about in the future. Another thing that's worth commenting on, though, a more hopeful thing, is that, and I actually think COVID has pushed us hard in this direction, has to do with the ways in which we can get smarter and around using technology to, again, address issues that have been there forever around the disconnection between what's happening in classrooms and what's happening on the university campus. So, video, of course, but now we're discovering, I think, that we can, use video as a really important tool for supervision and for bridging conversations between classroom teachers and teacher candidates and coursework instructors. So I'm hopeful about that.
You talked a little bit about the, I guess, resistance that some programs might have towards these types of assessments. I'm wondering what you think is the root of that resistance.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because I spent a lot of time thinking about this and dealing with this. The research that my colleagues and I have been doing for the last, well, really 20 years, ever since I was at UC Santa Barbara, actually, has been about trying to use data in a more strategic way to engage those issues. And one of the things that's really been difficult is getting particularly tenure line faculty to engage with the hard and time-consuming work of analyzing and interpreting data. So there is tremendous resistance in many places. There's some good studies that have come out just in the last year around EdTPA implementation that have made this dynamic very clear. So ladder faculty, by and large, are relatively unwilling and resistant, if you will. I don't really like that word, but I'll engage it for a second here. Are relatively resistant to committing the time and energy that's required to do program improvement work, collaborative program improvement work. But it's not the fault of people. It's not because they don't care about kids in classrooms. It's not because they don't care about teacher candidates. It's more due to the fact that university policies drive people away from collaborative work, because university tenure and promotion policies in particular push faculty very hard to invest their time and energy in their individual programs of research. The work of field supervisors also is not structured in ways that support them to collaborate with others. So in many programs, most that I've worked in, supervisors are compensated for the visits that they do to candidates in the field. They oftentimes are not paid to come to program meetings. And when they come to program meetings, oftentimes their voices are very weak. The people that really control those meetings are the people that have power and status within the university. And that's the latter faculty, who are not intentionally disengaged, but they're driven away from the work by promotion and tenure policies. So it's a terrible dilemma. Now, one of the things we did learn early on, right there at UCSB, was that if you get really good quality data on the table in front of people, they'll come, and if those data show people that something they're doing is not effective, that is a really powerful impetus to change. And a lot of the sense of being too busy to engage kind of melts away when a teacher, and even the most, I'm fond of saying, even the most pointy-headed ladder faculty member, when they find out that what they're teaching in their course is not being taken up or interpreted correctly by candidates in the classroom, you can't stop them from changing their course. It drives us nuts, because the teacher is kind of right there at the core of the identity once you get past all the glitzy stuff about research and grants and all that. So the key to getting that to happen is to get powerful, meaningful data on the table in front of them. So, but that's easy to say and hard to do. And the fact remains that university policy and university culture rewards people for working in silos and working individually, and that's a huge impediment to improving programs in the ways that we really need to do.
I think the next question maybe gets at a little bit of what you've said, or you've identified some of the kind of things that are currently going on that are making it difficult. What do you think needs to happen in teacher education?
That's a great question. One thing I wanted to add about that last piece about university policy is it's been that way. That very thing I just described about the ways in which policy drives people into their silos that John Goodlatte and his colleagues made, that was one of their major findings, is that universities are set up in ways that make it hard to do. Well, they called it renewal work. I tend to call it program improvement work. But so what can we do? I think, um, it's important to be realistic and pragmatic here. We're not going to change the university system in the ways that we might fantasize. But we can work around the edges. And one thing that that has been done at some universities is you probably know that there are three main boxes that define the criteria for tenure and promotion for university faculty. You got research, teaching, and service. In some universities, the three boxes are called research, research, and research. But one thing some places have done is to add a fourth box, so that there's a place for people to describe and receive some credit for their program improvement work, for the collaborative work of sitting down with their field-based colleagues, both field supervisors and hopefully cooperating teachers, and looking at data together and thinking together about how do we build stronger connections between our work at the university and in courses and what's going on in the field. So a fourth box is a place for people to describe that work and make it visible in the tenure and promotion process. Now, that isn't going to transform the institutional priorities necessarily, but it nibbles around the edges of it in a way that can be useful.
Mhm.
On the other side, on the field side, I think reallocating time and resources to support collaborative work can be done in ways that make a difference. They don't solve the problem. So a really simple thing is, don't have program meetings from 1 to 3. Have program meetings late in the afternoon so you can at least invite cooperating teachers. Another thing, this was an innovation also that I think Tina Sloan did this at UCSB, and I don't know if it's still in place or not, but I hope it is, and that is they implement a policy of stopping courses for a week and stopping all field supervision for a week each year so that everybody could come back to campus and look at the Peck data together. Which now, when you do that, when you compensate people for the time they spend working collaboratively, and when you have a rich and meaningful data source in front of people, now you're creating the conditions that allow people to think together about how to get smarter and more effective at their joint work. Another thing that's really important that happens there, especially when you have field-based data like Peck data or EdTPA data, where you're looking at videos and lesson plans and examples of student work, public school student work, is that the voices of the people that are close to that work, they get stronger in the conversations because they know what's going on. They can explain why it was that that classroom got totally out of control during that video, or they can explain why the lesson plans are built around a reading curriculum that is not being taught at the university. They can make sense of that, and that gives them stronger voices in the program deliberations, which I think is nothing but healthy. Course instructors and a lot of faculty do a pretty good job of listening, because they can tell that these people that never used to be in the meetings, or when they were in the meetings, they'd be really shy. They can tell they know what they're talking about. And it matters to the quality of dialogue. It matters to the conversations that begin to knit the pieces of the program together in ways that really matter to getting better outcomes with candidates.
How can we be sure, what should we look for in the tools that we're using to make sure that they're robust to use in this type of work?
Well, that's a great question, and there are tensions there, I think. We're just doing a big review right now of the literature on teaching performance assessments. So, on the one hand, you have context-stripped kinds of achievement test data, value-added measures and things like that. So I don't think those are irrelevant myself. There's a lot of reaction to that because those measures are so abstract and they ignore so much of what's incredibly important to the work of teaching. Absolutely true. On the other hand, the metaphor that's often used around value-added measures and other kind of, very abstract measures, follow-up surveys are kind of like this too, you know, that they're too abstract to be very useful for understanding what's going wrong, but they're a great fire alarm. So they can tell you that you know, the kids in the classrooms of your program, graduates, are not doing very well with math or reading or whatever it is. They can't tell you why, and they can't tell you very much about, in a very rich way, about what's going on. But they can tell you that you need to pay attention. You need to do a deeper dive to understand what is going on here. So kind of on the other end of the continuum, on the contextual end, you have performance assessments, which give you so much information. It's so, especially when you get down to looking at artifacts like videos and lesson plans and student work samples and stuff. The scores are helpful. They kind of point you in the right direction, but you got to get down into the real stuff to really see how candidates are interpreting what's going on in their work with kids, and to really understand the decisions they're making in ways that help you improve the way they're prepared. The issue there is that the deep contextualization of the work makes it harder to interpret them consistently, reliably. So you have a tension between a tool that's rich and meaningful and useful, but very hard to establish reliability in the ways that it's scored. And on the other hand, something where, you know, you have really strong reliability, but very problematic validity in the sense of capturing the important richness and the subtleties of teaching and learning. So.
Oh, it's very interesting. It's something I often wonder about. Navigating to special education, very data driven and very reliant on those types of things. General education is often or sometimes averse to those types of measures, and kind of figuring out how to navigate and how to, because my work's in collaboration, communicate across those things and kind of braid them together. It's very,
Yeah.
I don't
But
know.
it's a good model for bringing people together. I mean, it's that collaboration thing between general and special. It's hard because you know why it's hard. You live there. You know, there's status differences. There's cultural differences. There's, you know, differences in priorities around and methodologies around what you measure, how you measure it.
Yeah.
And stuff. So, and all of those differences are grounded in realities that have validity, in my view. The
Mhm.
tensions are not between people who understand and don't understand. It's between people who understand the world in different ways, and for good reason. So how you open up collaborative space that is respectful of the differences in perspective and really tries to get a kind of what you call a binocularity of vision
Mhm.
is, you know, that's hard to do. But.
What do you wish you would have known prior to or as you were learning to be a teacher educator?
Oh, I'm really glad you asked that because it kind of gets to me in one of my real issues around the field right now. And it also gets me to something I really appreciate about Citeran, which is its commitment to preparation of teacher educators. So one of the ugly facts about this field is that the people doing it, by and large, have no training. So for some reason, we think that if you've been through a doctoral program, and I don't care if it's in educational psychology or foundations or you know, curriculum, whatever it is, we think that that prepares you adequately to be a teacher educator. Maybe you've been a TA in a course, or maybe done a little field supervision, but the inattention to the preparation of teacher educators, I think, is really problematic, because there are really important things to know. You could begin, actually, I hope in Citeran you're actually reading John Goodlad's work. And if you're not, I hope you, I don't know who's running that show, but I sure would. Here's the book, never far from my desk. This is the 1990 study of those 29 programs. And if I think that getting ready to be a teacher educator should include understanding the historic problems that the field has faced and why the field has continued to flounder in trying to solve them. And one of the main reasons is that we pay so little attention to preparing people to do the work. And then we put them in environments where they're not rewarded for doing the work. So why should we be surprised that we keep going around in circles, you know? So anyhow, I think a really important part or something I certainly missed was being prepared to understand and respect and be intellectually engaged in the work of teacher preparation rather than just adding it on. Teacher education has been attached to the work of most faculty kind of as an afterthought. Mm-hmm. Even though positions are often defined in terms of the role faculty will play in teacher education programs. But by and large, there is no real preparation for that work. And so anyhow, I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. And that was missing in my preparation too. I came out of the doctoral program at UC Santa Barbara with good training in special ed. And I happen to have had quite a bit of experience as a teacher educator, both when I was at UCSB and before, but I had no training. I didn't know who John Goodlad was when I graduated from the UCSB program. I didn't know that there was a whole policy conversation going on at the national level to define standards of practice for teaching. I didn't know what the NTAS standards were. I didn't know what national board standards were. You don't know about the conversation that's been going on for like 20 some odd years now, or even longer, 30 years, in an effort to bring the field to some kind of consensus about what quality teaching means. If you don't have a consensus about what quality means in teaching, you're totally lost with measurement. And you're totally incapacitated to think in a coherent way and move the conversation. Now, you can change your definitions or your ideas or your way of defining teacher quality. But if you don't even know that there's been a conversation about this for 30 years, as I did not know, then it's really problematic that you're preparing a whole new cadre of teachers, in my view. So improving our preparation of teacher educators, I think, is actually one of the most important agendas, maybe the most important agenda for the field right now. And I'm as I said, I'm delighted that Sateran has really taken this up, and I hope, and there are nodes of interest and engagement around the country around that issue. We just started a thing at University of Washington that we called the Teacher Education Research Internship, preparing people by doing the work of collaborative program improvement research to understand that A, it can be intellectually rich and rewarding, B, it can be helpful in moving programs forward, and C, it can lead to publication and in ways that help you, climb up the tenure and promotion ladder. It doesn't have to displace the individual stuff, and I'm not naive enough to think it will or would, but it's a way of helping people understand the possibility of doing intellectually rewarding and practically important work in ways that that aren't all about your individual research program. And another thing about it is, about program improvement work in general, is that when you create a setting where people are looking at data together and talking together and thinking about improving their work together, people like it. Now, there's a lot to be said for how you create the time and space to do that. But the point I'm trying to make is that the collaborative work of improving programs can be rich and rewarding, and it can actually be a bit of a balm on the isolated nature and competitive nature of the university, where people are kind of busy in their offices trying to get their next publication or trying to get their next grant and not really connected with anybody else. So I think it's a really important opportunity for people to work together, and generally, when you create time and space for them to do it, they really like doing it. Makes them want to come to work about.
Yeah, I think, though, it's um, bringing up that what you said about kind of working collaboratively, it can be really hard. I know at UC Santa Barbara, the way it's set up, there are some ladder faculty who are mostly within the teacher education program, as you know, more teaching professors. The course load that they have, though, is such, and the breakup of the three boxes is such that just doing the teaching takes up so much of the time. And then, I feel like we're asked sometimes, not the field asks, like, please research what you're doing. Well, where's the time for researching what you're doing? And so what you bring up of this collaboration, where the, that's where the resources are to be able to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You do have to find ways of creating a space and creating enough time for people to devote their time to it.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I would say about it is, though, that when it's done well, it's so rewarding, you can't really stop people from doing it. They want to do it. And collaboratively writing is a really important part of navigating the tension between the individual performance requirements of the tenure and promotion system, or for somebody like you need to come out with some publications in order to get a job. Mm-hmm. So collaborating in the work is a way of generating publications. They're multi-authored publications, but they really help, and you can do a lot of them. And if you have a team working together, but the notion of collaborating is about teaming up to do intellectual work and writing for publication. And it's not the only thing that you might be doing as a tenure line faculty member, but it can be one of the things. No silver bullets, just little pieces of the puzzle that you can work in little different ways to help move things forward, I think. My biggest worry about the field in teacher ed is that the fractionated nature of the way we do the work will undermine people's motivation to do collaborative program improvement work.
That's all my questions. Is there any last things you want to share? Any things that are on the tip of your tongue?
Well, yeah, here's one thing I would like to share, and I say this fairly often, but I want to say it here, and that is, I love teacher educators. I mean, I just think that the level of moral, intellectual, and personal commitment to the work that I see in people doing the work is just lovely and so worthy of respect. In part because the work swims against this very difficult river of university policy and right now, not just the university, but policymakers at the state and national level are so critical of the field, and it takes so much personal commitment to swim against that stream, that I really, I love and admire people that do the work, and I've really loved working within the field. The field itself, the fact that it hasn't changed much since the time that John Goodlad and Roger Soder and Ken Sorotnick wrote about it 30 years ago, that drives me nuts. And I really hope that the field will somehow find a way to get its feet under itself and move itself and come to terms with these problems that have been so evident for so many years. So I think that's the challenge. Great people, really bad organizational policy.
It's just a case study on how that turns out.
Yeah.
So far, right?
Well, I suspect the way it'll go is that there are nodes of progress, and UCSB has been one of them over the years, but there are others, and I hope we can learn from them, and I hope that the field can get better at learning from its own experience.
Well, that seems like a nice kind of ending point. Thank you again, Kat, for taking the time to talk with me today. I've really learned a lot and have a lot of reading now from your insights on teacher education.